Welcome to Hidden Valley Media Vault. This is the pastor's blog for April 8, 2011.
Hey everybody, it's Pastor Chris. I had a few thoughts that I wanted to share with you. I was doing my life journals this week. I was out of town for a little while, and a couple of verses really hit me pretty powerfully. One was Psalm 65 verse 4 that talks about God drawing people, and that being He chooses us and draws us to Himself so that we might dwell in His courts, so that we could be in His temple. And of course, we know that talks about dwelling in the presence of God, that He wants us to dwell in His presence. But then I was reading in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, and there's one verse just right at the very end that Paul makes a statement to the church in Corinth, and it was pretty powerful for me, and I'll share why. Let me give you a little background. Corinth is a church that was kind of riddled with problems from being out of control. There being sin in the church. There being people operating in the flesh when it came to their spiritual gifts, and it came to how they were having church was becoming very earthly instead of heavenly. And Paul was gone. He had established the church, and so his apostolic authority wasn't there operating. And the leadership in that church had lost sight or focus of what Paul's original intention was with that church, and so what they needed to be doing. And Paul writes a very scathing 1 Corinthians. And this letter is established to set some boundaries, parameters, and rules for the Corinthians. This is how they needed to operate. Obviously, they've got some issues here with controls, so let me give you some very clear guidelines on how things need to go. And Titus, after the letter, and a lot of people say Titus was the one who delivered the letter from Paul, but Titus is there for a season, and then he comes back and he reports to Paul all the great things that are happening. Their hearts were repentant, they wanted to grow, they wanted to do great things, and they were really submissive to his authority as a leader in the church. And he's talking here Titus, he says in verse 13 of 2 Corinthians 7, we have been comforted in your comfort, and have we rejoiced exceedingly more for the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all. So it was a refreshing experience for Titus to go to this church that was embroiled in sin issues in the church and embroiled in lack of control. It was their submission to the apostolic authority that really made Titus very happy. But then at the very end of that chapter, he talks a little bit about how Titus, was really impressed by them. And then he says, therefore I rejoice that I have confidence in you in everything. I think that's interesting that Paul says that he's got confidence in the Corinthians in everything. Even though he had to point out a lot of their failures, a lot of the things that were going on and that have been going on in the church that would normally, in church today would make us really second guess their strength or stability as a church. Really, I think in today's marketplace of church economy, these guys would have needed to be censured. And yet, Paul rejoices and has confidence in them in everything. And I just think, what a full statement of understanding of God's grace and God's mercy and God's care and concern towards the Corinthians in this situation. And I think about how often we, Paul is speaking here from the Father's heart as a spiritual father. He calls himself a spiritual father over and over again in Scripture to these different churches. And so we see that he has this Father's heart, and I believe it's God's heart towards us. So often maybe we've done things wrong, or we've not gotten it right, or we've really frustrated ourselves in not following the rules exactly the way that we should, or doing all these things that we think we're supposed to do. But God's heart is that He has confidence in you in everything, regardless of what you've done in the past, because your past does not determine your future. Your past does not set the course for where you're going to go. And maybe you learn lessons, and maybe there's things that God uses all things to the good of those who are the called and who love Him, who are called according to His purpose. So, I want you to be encouraged. If a church like Corinth, with so many issues, so many problems, so much sin and hypocrisy and negative things going on, can receive the confidence from their spiritual father in everything, that he says, therefore I rejoice. He is happy and overjoyed that he has the confidence in them in everything. God says the same thing about you. So rejoice, knowing that God has confidence in you, in your ability to do the things that He wants you to do and to live life abundantly and fully, not bound to rules, but bound to the Spirit. So hopefully I encourage you. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for joining us. For service times and more information, visit sandpointchurch.com.